Hello everyone, welcome once again to another video lecture in reading visual arts. In this video, I shall continue my previous video discussion on visual narratives, but this time the focus will be on visual arts, visual culture. As mentioned in the previous video lecture, cultural literacy is very important in understanding or reading the context and content of a visual art. And so it is very important to consider also the cultural aspects of visual arts. Art is generally an extremely visual field or set of practices, even if we look outside the obvious candidates of painting, drawing, and sculpture. Considering the multimodality of arts that we have now, or even other visual materials, we can already tell that when we think about visual arts, there is already the presence of many elements. And since there are already many elements, that goes to say that we also need to consider a number of things in understanding a visual art. So it's very important that for us to truly understand and appreciate the meaning of visual arts, it's also significant that we identify the very identity of a specific virtual art. Art is something peculiar to human culture. It's unique to human culture only. And the word itself is etymologically related to artificial or produced by human beings. As discussed in the first set of lectures in this course, art is something that is not really natural. Okay, it's totally different from that is naturally produced by human beings because art is something that is man-made. Okay? It's done artificially by human beings, meaning it's the prerogative or the discretion of human beings to create pieces of art. The meaning of art evades firm definitions. Actually, we cannot say that there is one strict definition to understand art. In earlier periods, the word art means anything people did that required skill. Okay, so anything that required skill, then automatically it was considered art already. Let's say for medieval or Renaissance writers, for instance, they may refer to the art of war. So if you are skilled in combat, then you are already considered an artist. Or if you are skilled in pottery, then you are already considered an artist. Okay, because formerly artists were then just artisans or ordinary workers who apply their specialized skills within collectives or guilds. So, for example, if there is a group of teachers and they master the skill of teaching, then they are already considered artists in the field of education. So, this time, let's proceed to understanding reading artworks. While it is true that I have been mentioning this, but it's very important that we establish the foundation of accurate reading visual arts. So first is we need to have appropriate literacies to read an artwork. So in order for us to do this one, we need to acquaint ourselves with the elements that have to be present or elements that are present in visual arts. Of course, there is form. It has anything to do with its production that is not associated with its meaning making. So form is merely the production of something. It considers the shape, the structure of something, but it does not necessarily link with the context. So here we are talking about some elements such as medium, we have compositional elements, color, line, shape, and texture. So for the medium use, of course, we know that it has a different effect when, let's say, the medium primarily used in making a painting is watercolor. Or if it uses another medium, then it could also have a different impact on the quality of the artwork. Compositional elements, of course, these could be the present elements, the images, the figures, the multimodality of a specific visual art. And then we know that color, line, shape, and texture also create much meaning to the visual art. They contribute also in the contextualization of the message. And then Apart from the form, it's also important that we understand how to examine the content. The technical aspects of its production allows us to begin the process of unpacking the work, classifying, categorizing, and critiquing the work. So in examining the content, you might want to ask yourself what the work is all about. Is it a painting determining a sociocultural practice? Or is it a sculpture showing a historical fact? Okay. What is it saying? So you also need to focus on the message that is being conveyed to the audience. So you being the audience, of course, you also need to identify by considering the compositional elements of that visual art. So you need to focus on what it tries to suggest or say to you as the audience. Third, you also need to consider other issues to which it might be referring. For example, the background, the history. So you also need to consider other frames of arts. So here you need to include intertext. You also need to center on its subject matter. What is being emphasized in a visual art? If it is a poetry, does it talk about environment? Does it talk about love? Or does it talk about other values? Or if it is a painting, does it talk about history? Does it talk about culture? So these are the things that you need to consider. And of course, you need to consider other elements present, such as the figure, okay, the structure, the form, the genre. Is it song? Is it music? Is it sculpture? Is it architectural structure? And of course, the narrative, the presentation of the realities in that visual art. The context in which it was made and disseminated, and of course, is now being read. So you also need to collectively consider this. What's now the context and try to relate it with the content and the form of the visual art. This time, let's discuss the field of artistic production. Now, we know that there are a lot of institutions in our society nowadays that produce art or that are engaged in producing artistic works. Bourdieu states that art can be understood as comprising a cultural field, which he calls the field of cultural production. So when you say there is artistic production, then it's also equated to saying that there is also cultural production. Field means everything that is done and everyone involved in doing it within a discrete area of social practice. So the following are the fields of artistic production. So first one, we have institutions. And these include art museums, publishing houses, public relation firms, government art bodies. So all of these institutions are involved or engaged in artistic production. And not only that, somehow they're also involved in cultural production. Second one, of course, the people, the individuals who are into this field. So you have artists, we have curators, directors, conservators, we have promoters, and other artists who advocate for artistic progression in our society. And then we also have the concept of aesthetic judgment. Immanuel Kant, who is closely identified with the discipline of aesthetics, associated sound understanding with judgment. So when you say that you have sound understanding of a visual art, you interpret it based on the different considerations that you did, then it's automatically equated to saying that there is also judgment on your part. Now, in his estimate, the ability to judge work of art is dependent upon the clarity of thought and knowledge and not on the emotions. So Immanuel Kant here suggests that not at all times when we read visual arts, we activate the emotions in us. Sometimes it is a necessity to have clarity of thought and knowledge. For example, if we see a painting and then it talks about a socio-cultural practice before or a historical fact, you cannot really activate your emotion or solely your emotion to understand that painting, right? How will you be able to connect your emotion with a historical fact? In that case, there is this significance or there is this necessity to make sure that you have the clarity of knowledge, that you have at least a grasp of what history is, so that you can understand the painting. So, the point of Kant here is that it's not always emotions. It's not always emotions that help us to read visual arts more effectively. He reiterated beauty was not simply something that might bring pleasure. In his book, Analytical of Beauty, he stated that the delight which determines the judgment of taste is independent of all interest. Because for him, seeing something as beautiful meant seeing it as an image rather than as a real object. So when you appreciate something, let's say a visual art to be beautiful, it does not necessarily mean that you, as the one perceiving it to be beautiful, see the image or see that object or that visual art as a real object. Okay? For example, when you see a painting of an apple, you do not see it as an actual apple, right? You see it as an image of an apple which could reflect or project or which arrests the reality of what an apple really is. Okay? And that is beauty there. That is how we judge aesthetics or aesthetic value. The aesthetic object was to be regarded in terms of formal quality. So you look at the proportion, the harmony, the variety, rather than in terms of practical desirability, like your perception that it's really an apple in the real world. So let's go back to the sample I mentioned. When you look at a painting of an apple, you look at it as a painting, as a visual art, as an image that represents a reality, but you do not look at it as the apple itself or as an apple, as a real apple, an object. And you give your judgment to it based on the harmony of the different elements found in that painting and the proportion of all these elements. So for example, the color, the hue, the shadows, all of these things, once they come in harmony and there is proportion despite the variety, then there is this appreciation of the aesthetic value or the beauty of that visual art. And then we also have aesthetic pleasure. Aestheticists wrote expressly about the sensate elements of aesthetic pleasure. The sphere of sensation that was amenable to aesthetics was somehow above and beyond actual sensation. It was committed to process and reason. So it's very important that you understand first the process on how you would understand or better appreciate aesthetic value and give your reason after it so that perhaps you could think about what makes it a valuable piece of visual art that has aesthetic value. What this means in practice is that the art viewer, as a good aesthetician, could not be personally and viscerally moved by a beautiful object or person. Any pleasure taken must be pleasure in a beautiful form, for instance, rather than an actual body, something that leaves the pleasure of erotic imagery rather ungrounded. So this goes to say that when you appreciate a visual art, you appreciate it because you have reasons behind. So for example, you appreciate its aesthetics or you judge it to be aesthetically appealing because of the harmony and the proportion of elements found in that visual art. You do not appreciate it just because it is a representation. It's solely a representation of reality. You appreciate the aesthetic value because you judge the presence of the different elements and principles in that visual art. So that ends my discussion on culture and visual arts. So once again, I'd like to emphasize that in order for us to better understand visual arts, we look at the aesthetic value as well. And when we judge the aesthetic value, we consider not only the representation of that art of the reality, but also of its harmony or proportion, the presence of harmony or unity despite the variety of all these elements found in that visual art. And also, we get to better understand it by having good judgment or sound reasoning as to why that is actually aesthetically pleasing. And of course, we need to understand that there are also different fields of artistic production that could involve both the institutions that produce culture and arts and the people who are engaged in doing this activity. So if you have any question about this discussion, kindly post them on the open forum. Thank you very much for watching this lecture.